Greetings, friends. It is Monday, August 28th, and Felix and I are joined today by, it's my favorite time of year, it's Blowback Season 4. We are joined today by the co-hosts and creators of Blowback, Brendan James and Noah Kulwin. Gentlemen, welcome back.
Hey, homies.
Hey, guys.
All right. Brendan, Noah, Blowback Season 4 just came out. You know, we got to get you on. This is probably, I listened to the first 3 episodes. This is probably like your season that is most ambitious in scope. And the story you've chosen to tell, the history that you're digging into this season is sort of like the genesis of the term blowback, at least in its most, a popular conception of like 9/11. So let me ask you, like, why Afghanistan? What drew you to this topic this time? And like what did you begin to discover as you started researching this season?
Yeah, it's definitely the most on the nose understanding of blowback. Probably is at least for our generation. The term itself was coined by a ex-CIA guy, Chalmers Johnson, years ago. But as we've found every season, sometimes it's a punchy title for the show. Sometimes we're talking about blowback. Sometimes we're not. Sometimes we're talking about something that is said to be blowback, but is a little bit more complicated. And then this is. Yeah, I think that really kind of uber example, and we wanted to dive into it because really of the withdrawal in 2021, and it wouldn't just be about Afghanistan, this endless war, but it would be about a somewhat sort of beginning, middle of an end now, for at least for the time being, of American involvement. And there's other reasons. I mean, we like to jump around. I like to jump around. We got to go to the 1980s. We've never really gotten to cover that decade before in the show, and we got to kind of follow all these colorful characters through a real 40-year saga, which, as you say, is like a longer period of time than we've ever tried to cover before.
I can share with our listeners that if you are fans of the works of Hideo Kojima, you will not be disappointed by this season. And the little audio samples and drops you guys throw in there is incredible. But I guess like in the first episode, you lay out some themes that are developed over the course of this season. And I guess the first one I want to talk about is the connection between political Islam and like jihad and Western intelligence services. Because like I know this, we don't need to get into it sounds conspiratorial to say, but like would fundamentalist Islam as a political movement in Afghanistan or really anywhere else in the Middle East. I know Afghanistan is in the Middle East, but like, could you lay out like the connections between political radical Islam and Western intelligence?
Yes. Well, I think it would be a stretch to say that it wouldn't exist. Period, end of sentence. There's a long, history up until that moment in the 1980s or late 70s of political Islam growing in different parts of the world. I mean, you already had the Muslim Brotherhood existing for many decades, and writings that sort of changed and grew and became more of a outright opposition to modernity and all of that. Sayyid Qutb and some stuff that I'm sure some listeners are aware of. But as far as like a really contemporary version of political Islam, whose foot soldiers or commanders are still with us today, that was really, I think you could argue that was cooked up in that key period. And, Noah and I know Noah could talk about the Safari Club was the nexus of Western and regional intelligence agencies that organized that new strain, or rather channeled that new strain of political Islam. And Noah, you could probably speak on that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you could think of like at the same time that the process that we call globalization was unfolding, one of the sort of new information streams that was going along and traveling around the world in that time was like political Islam, in particular sort of radical political Islam. And one of the sort of, I guess, superhighways, if you will, like that on which it traveled was this kind of route between China and Pakistan and the United States and Africa and even Southeast Asia. And the Safari Club in the 1970s was at the sort of insistence of a French intelligence official Alexandre de Morange. What they did was I believe it was named for a literal there's a place. In other words, but
you can actually visit the Safari Club.
I mean, I don't know if you can. I maybe they shoot you on site. I don't know.
Is it like a big room with like zebra heads and stuff like that?
I think of it as kind of like the Ben Gazzara's house on the inside at the end of Roadhouse.
Roadhouse, yeah, exactly.
Where it's just like, and there's like a big fat guy like waiting to get smothered by a big bear statue.
Who are the members of the Safari Club?
So it's Saudi Arabia. It's Saudi Arabia, the United States. General Z is Pakistan, right, Brendan? Or is it's
a loose confederation. Sometimes people are showing up, sometimes they're not. Saddam Hussein was said to be on the periphery of it. But yeah,
as were Israel and South Africa, for example.
I feel like Saddam showing up there, that's sort of like an obligatory social thing, like going to your friend's one-man show at a DIY venue.
Saddam, I got a good venue for my my quintet. My dance and my cycle. I'd really appreciate it if you could come.
But most of all, the Shah of Iran was our boy in the Middle East at that time, and was while a secular dictator for the most part, he was just as interested in dicing it up with radical Islam in his neighbors. And the Shah was really our most, before Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, he was our heaviest hitter in Afghanistan, because there was an increasingly progressive and eventually outright communist government in Afghanistan that was not looking for the same goals and the same allies that the Shah was. And so this club, which sounds very conspiratorial, but it's just admitted to by all these guys years later when they're like talking at Georgetown or doing a C-SPAN thing, and it's all those years ago. It's safe to say it now. It was really pulling the strings all along. And then by the time you get this Marxist revolution in Afghanistan in the late 70s, which precipitates the Soviet invasion, these guys are really starting to recruit the warlords and the mujahideen that we know and have loved ever since.
And it's also worth thinking about how, the Shah, because he was our biggest boy, like, for example, I think like about a third of all American arms sales abroad in the 1970s went to the Shah. Once the Shah fell, all of those weapons went into the hands of an enemy. And so we had a new strategic rival that had to be combated. So Afghanistan, from a strategic point of view from the U.S., where Zbigniew Brzezinski and later William Casey and so forth were sitting, they thought holy this is a new force we have to counter. And what's more, in 1979, it was not just in Iran where you had this sort of wave of religious revolution kind of sweeping. In Saudi Arabia, for example, religious extremists took over the Kaaba, and they were only dispelled with the assistance of French special forces. They had to mop up the blood of the place. So there was a real, I think, which is just all to say that political Islam was also viewed in that moment as a really powerful and ascendant force. And so, a weapon that could be deployed in Afghanistan, as it was.
Yeah, I will note that with the taking over of the Grand Mosque and the seizure by French commandos, there is a lot of funny historical tidbits and rumors around that. But it was less a coherent and broad form of political Islam, and more of it was sort of like a bunch of bumpkins who they had a cousin who had declared himself the Mahdi. It wasn't as linked to any grand transnational movement, but it certainly did, cause fears within the kingdom. And the of course funny repeated historical rumor of that is the French commandos that were sent in to seize it back for the Saudis, that they were forced to convert to Islam to enter it, and then converted back to Catholicism after the mission was done. though people have said that that's made up. I choose to believe it.
Well,
I believe that 100%.
There's
That's like way cooler than the Bin Laden's cover story.
Yeah.
the I guess the point of our season is there were a lot of bumpkins, and there were those who were more organized, but everyone could get something out of the jihad against the Soviets in Afghanistan, and that is indeed where I think a hitherto or an unprecedented level of collaboration began. And to your point, Will, we try to make it an angle of this season, which I'm getting in a large part from a scholar named Timothy Mitchell. He wrote a great book called Carbon Democracy, and he has a chapter called Mick Jihad. And Mick Jihad kind of is this, basic idea that you don't need to think about the big secular capitalism and the reactionary militant Islam as separate as we all are kind of told to by either side. They do a lot more collabs than they've ever wanted to let on.
Well, a point you make in the first episode, and I think like an easy shorthand for thinking about this, is that with few notable exceptions, the more U.S. backed a state in the Islamic world is, the more U.S. backed it is, the more Islamic the nature of the state is in its tenor and character.
Typically. And we point out, obviously, there's exceptions. I mean, Iran would be an obvious example.
Mm-hmm.
However, before that, it was one of the most closely aligned states in the region with the U.S., and it was the Shah. But even then, we have cooperated with Iran in many times and places. Most famously, Iran-Contra was when the Reagan administration got caught with their hands in the cookie jar. But they were also open to going after the Taliban with us once we flipped on the Taliban, or they flipped on us, whichever you want to say. And we're offering search and rescue and full support for the Northern Alliance. They've been funding the anti-Taliban warlords a lot longer than we had. So, or rather at that moment. So yeah, but in general, you got the Gulf monarchies, you got the Islamic, states in the Middle East and Asia are typically American allies. And it was the kind of Baathists in Syria and Iraq, more the Syrians than the Iraqis. It was the secular PLO. Movements like this were not very friendly to the Americans at all. So we made nice with everyone. You can go back to the Saudis in the 1930s, when we inked a deal with them. It's just sort of an undercovered thing.
And we chose Sunni over Shia, which is a subject that I cover in a bonus interview with Cy Hirsch, because he wrote a really kind of seminal article on this about how like America sort of, the global war on terror could be viewed as part of how we took this kind of policy even more global than it already was. But, because, Iran, like the main reason that it is not, or not the main reason, but like a major factor in why it is not a strategic friend of ours, despite its, religiosity, is the fact that it's a Shia state. And if you look at a lot of the different Gulf states, Bahrain, for example, that's it's a Sunni Arab minority that runs the state where you have a lot of, Shia minorities. And that's a dynamic that can be replicated and is found in a lot of places in the Arab world. So there is also a degree to which like that distinction, I guess, just shouldn't be ignored.
Yeah, and even in Gulf nations that have a sizable Sunni majority, there's still a very significant Shia population. The last accounting in Saudi Arabia, which I believe was like something like 30 years ago, and so it could be very different now, was that they were 30% Shia. And yeah, one of the interesting advantages, and you see it a ton in Afghanistan, it was not the first time that we saw this policy from Gulf states, but probably the formalization of it. Like with these hyper religious U.S. allies, the advantage is like you can, especially in a multipolar world, you can send your population of extremely religious or sometimes recent converts or not that religious, angry young men to whatever regional conflict against an enemy that you have no means of fighting through conventional warfare or even conventional intelligence. And it was incredibly useful to the Gulf monarchs and probably even more useful to us.
Well, especially us because George H.W. Bush was CIA director in the middle of the 70s when, after the Church Committee and Pike hearings, there was a real attempt to curtail the CIA's power and scope. And essentially what Bush tried to do, and I think successfully did to a large degree, was offshore a lot of work that he wasn't supposed to be caught doing at that moment, or that the CIA guys weren't supposed to be caught doing. And that was, with regard to Afghanistan, eventually a much closer relationship with the Saudi intelligence, and then eventually the Pakistani intelligence as well. But the standing relationship between the Bush family and several families in Saudi Arabia meant that all Bush had to do initially was just call up, the Saudi intelligence head, and they both had, dealings with similar banks and similar investors, and say, hey, we need to be laying low right now, but we're happy to share a portfolio with you guys. And that got us started with a whole lot of stuff that follows us into 9/11 and beyond,
And you could also think of, we focus on the show on, for example, BCCI, the shadow
I definitely want
bank.
to talk about that in a second.
Yeah, but it's also, I think a good way of helping it is like BCCI was like the sort of underbelly sliver of like, again, this process where it's like, they're inking like the U.S. and the Saudis are inking deals through BCCI. They're also inking deals through David Rockefeller's Chase Manhattan Bank. And there are a lot, this is a process of like, this is the seamy underside of a friendship that was, just a really torrid fucking romance, really, that began in that time.
Well, Noah, since you brought it up, let's talk BCCI, because like when we were plotting out Poppy Part 3 in Houston, I realized that like the third part of the Poppy series was very much, because we were in Houston, it's about this nexus of like intelligence, the petroleum, and banking and finance, and like that's what the city of Houston is. But BCCI in general is one of the most astonishing. It is the 2001 monolith of all, like the emperor of all. It's a Pandora's box of like everything evil that has ever happened in the last 40 or 50 years. Could you just like give me just a brief overview on what was BCCI, who was involved in it, and what did it do?
So BCCI was a bank created by a Pakistani guy. It's important to say that it wasn't created in Pakistan because there's a lot that remains kind of murky about where exactly it was hatched. But the guy who created it was named Aga Hassan Abidi. And he was this kind of like strange, like it would be fair to call him like a guru figure. You can look it up on Wikipedia. He's got some weird speeches. And the bank was set up at with the assistance of Saudi and Central Intelligence, and I guess the then incipient ISI, to effectively serve as an international clearinghouse for all sorts of different operations that these intelligence agencies were running. It would later emerge that, supposed left-wing terrorists, although, probably ops like Abu Nidal, were run out of BCCI, but also it's where the Afghan Mujahideen got a lot of their money. And I believe it was it Adnan Khashoggi who staked it or who just ran it? I forget.
Khashoggi, I don't think you ran it, but this is another expression of the Safari Club. It's like the financial,
yes.
Expression of them. So there's drug running, there's this sort of, fees for assassinations. Really every criminal act you could think of, as you guys have probably covered, was run through BCCI. But one of the things that was the Mujahideen. And
also BCCI's customer base was like, this was during a time when, for example, the number of Pakistani immigrants in London were, swelling, and in England were too. So BCCI had this really large depositor base that it was able to tap from, these like growing immigrant networks. And so when the bank went tits up, it was a lot of those people who ended up being really fucked because the bank was not actually chartered. It was chartered in, I believe, Luxembourg and the Cayman Islands. So it had this like dual registration. It was like, they exploited the fact that there was nobody at all looking at their books.
Yeah, they tried to make it look like a third world, development bank.
Yes.
It was supposed to present itself as people would say now, as a woke bank, but was in fact, a very shadowy institution.
In fact, it was a based bank. It was not woke. In fact,
That's the B in BCCI is for based.
Based credit and commerce.
Exactly.
This out in the Muslim world, they have a term called anti-wokia that ranges back to the time of Muhammad.
Pretty much in the Saudi context.
Another huge part of this story is the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And before I get into the specifics of that, I would like to talk about a few of the sort of American pop cultural understandings of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. They come in two movies that jump to mind. The first of which you talk about in the first episode, of course, Rambo 3.
Yes.
And you drop the absolute bombshell that this film is dedicated to the brave Mujahideen fighters is 100% cap. And
Yes.
I got hooked deep by that one. It was too good
we
not
both
to
did.
believe.
We all did because I think in our book
It's
we
in
made
a dedication of our book. Yeah.
I know, and we try to make a joke about it, but in doing more research, yeah, it's a hoax. It was just someone who really nailed the early Photoshop, I guess. But we also say the reason it goes so far in our internet culture, in our pop culture trivia, is because it is spiritually true that we all kind of feel like that happened, but, which it just didn't happen in that particular case.
You don't need to have the words "this film is dedicated to the brave Mujahideen fighters of Afghanistan" to understand that is 1,000% the message of Rambo 3.
Oh yeah, and I rewatched it, and it is it incorporates a lot of myths at the time that we go into in the show. I mean, there's a lot of sort of typical like trademark blowback style stuff in there where we accused the Soviets of doing well, first of all, to your point,
chemical weapons
we built a case, totally debunked, never been proven. We say that we exaggerated a lot of stuff about body counts and things like this, but also most of all, and the point we make in our first episode is it was really a way to both change the subject from Vietnam, which had only really just concluded a couple years before 79,
but also flip the myth of Vietnam itself. Yeah,
correct. And there's some ways where it's like the Soviet Union's Vietnam, of course. I mean, they got bogged down in a quagmire, but I mean that's not the only thing that characterizes the Vietnam conflict. That's a very punchy and marketable way of putting this in headlines in America and across the world over and over again. But it was also a way to project everything we did onto the Soviets from the get-go that they did not a lot of times, in fact, do. But in other ways, it was not a lot like Vietnam. I mean, there was no grand theory of dominoes and what needed to be done in Asia or the Middle East to communize or to decapitalize the grand chessboard like we were thinking in Vietnam. It was a very reluctant invasion, in fact.
And if you remember Rambo 2, First Blood Part 2, Rambo, I mean, like that was the movie where we get to win the Vietnam War. He rescues the POWs, but the POWs are being held by a direct intervention of the Soviet Red Army. And they have the big attack helicopters. He blows that up at the end. But like you said, like the screenwriters in Hollywood or whatever, and the general military industrial entertainment complex was projecting onto the Vietnamese exactly what we would have done in their position, which is directly fucking.
It's really funny. There's a line in Rambo 3 where Troutman says to the kind of grim-faced Soviet commissar who's the avatar for the USSR, and he's like,
"But you do not seem to realize I'm providing a way out for us both."
You expect sympathy? You started this damn war, now you have to deal with it.
And we will. It is just a matter of time before we achieve a complete victory.
There won't be a victory. Every day your war machines lose ground to a bunch of poorly armed, poorly equipped freedom fighters. The fact is that you underestimated your competition. If you'd studied your history, you'd know that these people have never given up to anyone. They'd rather die than be slaves to an invading army. You can't defeat a people like that. We tried. We already had our Vietnam. Now you're going to have yours.
We already had our Vietnam. Now you're going to have yours. But it's like Vietnam has become it's like a proper noun of just meaning things like the war that is either the Vietnam War, the literal Vietnam War, or the Afghanistan War, or whatever. It doesn't even mean a country anymore. It's like a shorthand by then. And that's what we try to apply.
Yeah, insane to say this about, I mean, really Vietnam in the first place. But like the attitude of the national security state and the military establishment seems to be like it's unfair for another country to support whoever we're fighting.
Yeah.
Okay, the second more contemporary film that I think like covers the same history you're talking about is the Mike Nichols, Aaron Sorkin film Charlie Wilson's War. How would you rate the history of portraying in that movie, and in particular the characters like Texas Congressman Charlie Wilson, played by Tom Hanks, and the Greek Gus, the CIA, Afghanistan hand, played by Philip Seymour Hoffman? How do you guys, like, having done this whole season? Did you rewatch Charlie Wilson's War, or like what do you make of that film and what it says about a more contemporary 21st century sort of post-war on terror understanding of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and our intervention in that conflict?
I chose not to rewatch it because life's too short. But I think that there's probably a lot of good stuff in there that is true about Charlie Wilson himself and Gus Stavrakoutos, Greek Gus, played by Philip Seymour Hoffman, in a great performance by Philip Seymour Hoffman.
Fantastic.
I think if I recall, there is a lot of the propaganda that, you know, if it's a good movie, I don't really care. We were just talking about Rambo 3. It's still a fun movie, but I think it definitely has less of an excuse to take on propaganda about what the war was really about all those years later than Rambo 3 did in the thick of it. And I think it was still upholding a lot of kind of bromides of American, you know, we had to do this. But then again, I haven't seen it in a while.
I didn't rewatch it, but like the movie does not really deal at all with like how brutal the Mujahideen were. Like it really kind of just like lionizes them completely. And then the other thing that it does, it makes like the Julia Roberts character, Joanne Herring, and Tom Hanks. It's not that like it sanitizes or makes them more likable. It's just that like it doesn't really show you. I mean, I guess that is sanitizing. Like it doesn't show you the fact that like they like love General Zia of Pakistan so much to the point that they were like willing to apologize for his, you know, butchery at their cocktail party.
Yeah, I don't remember. I don't remember that in the movie, but there's a great bit in the book where Joanne Herring, Julia Roberts' character, is holding a big, a big swanky party to fundraise basically and to do deals about this new project of the Mujahideen. And Zia is there as an honored guest, and she sort of clinks her glass so everyone will listen up. She said, before I introduce our guest, I just want to make very clear he did not murder the previous president of Pakistan, which of course he did in a military coup. And all of her bougie friends were sort of pulling their collars a little bit, thinking like, oh, I don't know if we should have come to this party. But they all paid up.
He's sort of a Rodney Dangerfield figure from Caddyshack. But one of the I mean, I despise that fucking movie. And even though it is a great Philip Seymour Hoffman performance, I still see it as like a waste of very finite time. Mm-hmm. Finite time we had left for him. But there's a lot of things I hate about the movie. My least favorite fucking thing is at the end, they try to reconcile the aftermath of all this. And probably the worst set of lines Aaron Sorkin has ever written. After, like they win, basically, Charlie Wilson goes, wait a minute, we're not sticking around to build schools? To make them to make them less Muslim.
And then it's
like the point of this?
Well, and then like we did build the schools, and the guy who built all the schools was just like running a fraud. The Greg Mortensen, the 3 cups of tea guy.
Well, I'll say this: I don't know if it was Mike Nichols and it might have been Tom Hanks. We went on that Hassan show, and I said this, but apparently at the end, the plan was to have it show September 11th and the planes hitting the towers. That was like in the script. It was Nichols' intention, but either Tom Hanks or someone else was like, no, this comes out in Christmas. Let's not.
Tom Hanks' CIA handler said, sorry, we can't do that.
Well, I mean, like another interesting detail that the movie excluded was Representative Charlie Wilson's prodigious cocaine habit.
Is that not in the movie?
Yeah, that's not in the movie at all. It
Wait,
shows him
what?
catting around, but he's not blowing rails and like
No
he was
way.
known. He was known
Yeah.
as Cocaine
You have a
Charlie.
very funny audio clip from like C-SPAN where some angry constituents just like, buddy, you got a cocaine problem. And he's just like, oh. And he goes, Charlie Wilson says, I've dealt with that problem about 5 times now.
No. He said the guy is like saying, like we should have a more diplomatic policy towards the Soviets. And then this guy says, well, and then Charlie Wilson says, well, I'm glad you're not in my district. And the guy says, oh, well, I wish I was. Hey, you still have a cocaine problem? And then Charlie Wilson goes, I've been cleared of that.
He goes, I say, and he starts just foghorn leghorning out live on TV. But it's a great clip. But yeah, he was Cocaine Charlie, and he also did a hit and run. I don't know if that's in the movie.
No, it's not.
He did a hit. This is amazing. I thought all this like salacious stuff was at least part of it, but he hit someone in DC and then literally was like rushing to the airport so that the DC or Virginia police couldn't take him in, and he got on a plane to Pakistan to go do like another fact-finding mission. So he literally escaped.
Yeah, that all of his like debauchery is boiled down to just like, this guy loves drinking champagne in a hot tub, and maybe he gets too much pussy.
Yep. Okay. That makes sense. Then it's because I heard he liked the movie, and if you really represented his life, we have some choice quotes even in the first episode. He is, first of all, I think he's awesome. Let me just be clear. Like all of that is awesome. But
I endorse all of that.
But yeah, then of course the dark side are all the deals he's making, because though he appeared a buffoon, he was actually a pretty good natural politician behind the scenes. And as he put it, he elevated the cause of the Mujahideen, who were raping their enemies and their prisoners, who were
you have an amazing
drugs.
quote about from Greek Gus where he returns, shall we say, a rather vivid description of like our allies in Afghanistan.
He loves the term cornholing, and he had reason to use it a lot in his memoir or his biographer. And yeah, I mean, it is. We go into like the real unvarnished portrait of the Mujahideen, and we talk about the Soviet brutality as well. And it was a lot like Vietnam, I guess, in that sense, that Soviet troops were just
and also that like a lot of the violence from the Soviets was just like, it was bombing. And like, if you want to like look at the actual, like Adam Two's, you can just Google it. He did a pretty good, like some of just how much ordnance they dropped. But like, that's the real similarity with Vietnam, but that's not what people talk about when they meant to that comparison.
And I just throw in just that the Vietnamese resistance, like Ho Chi Minh was not invented and paid by the Soviet Union or China. And you can see that, there's a whole thing you can go into here, but that's a big whiff on the metaphor, because after the war was over, Vietnam built its own state, and of course, you reunified, and it has its problems like any developing country, but has become like a member of nations and all this other stuff. The warlords we were backing in Afghanistan immediately tried to kill all of each other and blow up Kabul, which was the only place untouched by, or one of the few places untouched by the war in the 80s. And then, of course, became Taliban and Al-Qaeda adjacent and all this other stuff. So there's another real important difference in the Vietnam metaphor that people like to make.
Another fascinating bit of history that you guys delve into is the events preceding the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which I don't think a lot of people understand, and the history of the Afghanistan Communist Party, and also like its rather surprising connections to the CIA.
So essentially, there was a split between on the eve of the Soviet invasion. What was really going on was that there was a split, and in one faction you had there was a more moderate wing, and then there was a more radical wing, and the more radical wing was behind this guy Amin.
Hafiz al-Amin was the head of became eventually the head of the Communist Party of Afghanistan, but for a while he was the number two to a guy named Taraki, who he eventually killed. He was associated with Columbia University because of programs that the Americans would kind of try to, make nice with promising young students from developing nations. However, the issue is that the programs he was a part of and the Afghan sort of student society he was a part of while in Colombia were later revealed by Ramparts magazine and others to be fronts for the CIA. So there's an odd cloud of suspicion around this guy who does go back to Afghanistan. He had been to Colombia twice for 2 different degrees, and then was always the one pushing a more violent and more, all-consuming and, as you could say, like extreme line. Whether he was a part of the CIA has never really been confirmed, whether he was an asset, a working asset. We found a really interesting passage in a memoir that a friend of the show, Marissa Shepard, had to translate, in which a Soviet general says, here's what I saw in the records where Amin was defending himself from his fellow Afghan communists about being part of the CIA. Whether this was like something where he was playing the CIA or he was, using everybody at the same time, we'll never know. But we try to mention other, there have been instances where leaders of radical communist or, extremist parties abroad are not necessarily free of any association with our own intelligence agency. You have Pol Pot and Zbigniew Brzezinski, as a matter of fact, were in contact throughout the same period. And a Mexican president was a CIA asset.
Portillo.
Yeah, Portillo. So, whether Amin is one of those guys, it's an interesting point of intrigue in the show. But he eventually invites both America and the Islamists and the Soviets to kind of do favors for him all at once. And the Soviets' favor was to come in and give him backup against some of his enemies. But what the Soviets do is to themselves say, this guy's chopping everybody's head off, and we just need to go in there and get rid of him because he's as much of the problem as the Islamists. So,
and they kill him almost immediately. After intervening to support his communist government.
Yeah, they pulled a switcheroo there.
Yeah,
they definitely pulled a switcheroo there.
Okay, you just brought him up, and I definitely wanted to get to this guy because he's one of the people most responsible for all of this blowback and is one of the most underrated evil figures in American foreign policy. I'm, of course, talking about the Carter administration, Zbigniew Brzezinski. Could you talk a little bit about this guy and what led him to adopt the most get Carter and the U.S. government to adopt the most maximally hawkish position vis-a-vis Russia and Afghanistan?
Yeah, so I think that the sort of easy way to think about how somebody like Brzezinski comes to direct policy is that he was, sort of tarred and viewed as a lib, because he was a socially liberal guy, but he was always this hardline anti-communist. And the Carter administration was, it came into power and had been elected, and their strategic vision had really been, sort of oriented around this, domestic response to Watergate. And so that meant that in some respects that Brzezinski leading the National Security Council was pretty empowered to engage in some, extensive funning games as far as policy was concerned to check the Soviet Union. And Brzezinski, as a sort of measure of course, believed that the Soviet Union's downfall was the overriding necessity for all American policy. It was everything he believed, everything he understood. And some people we've interviewed, Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould, the way they put it is is that Brzezinski views this as it's a throwback to the 19th century as a means of countering imperial Russia. And he constructed a policy in Afghanistan, or helped to, along those lines in the 1970s.
Yeah, Brzezinski could never get over not only the history between Russia and Poland in his time, but hundreds of years earlier.
Yeah.
And he was just absolutely dedicated, fanatical, not even so much against communism, but against what he saw as modern day Russian imperialism, whatever you want to say. And he is unapologetic, or was unapologetic about using militant Islam to achieve that goal. I found a funny clip where he's being asked by, and I play it in the show later in the show, where he's being asked by an interviewer, who's from that region, you've said that the Taliban were sort of small potatoes compared to taking down the evil empire. Do you still feel that way? And he's unrepentant. He says, imagine if the Soviet Union was around now. Just imagine where we'd be. And he says that they were the ones training all the terrorists. And I guess he's trying to say the PLO and secular Marxist terrorists who would, they would hijack planes. It was definitely a dicey time. But he's trying to say they were the ones creating Al-Qaeda because all these Arab terrorists, I guess in his mind, were all kind of interchangeable. But in fact, he was the guy who, more than anyone else, was pushing for this grand architecture of jihad.
Is that the same clip where he sort of chides the woman interviewing him? Because he's like, if you phrase the question more intelligently, I could answer it more accurately. But when you use terms like bait, it just confuses things. And she just goes, "I'm quoting you directly." And he goes, I never said bait. I never said we would bait them into the Soviet Afghanistan.
There's an interview with a French magazine that he forever claimed. Once it got embarrassing, after 9/11, he said, "Oh, that's a very loose translation." But it's like the whole interview is just one long misquote. How did that happen? And then we found, talking with people who are on the record or have done their own interviews with colleagues of Brzezinski, that he, in private, he was saying that. I mean, whether or not he wants that to be recorded in an article is one thing, but he could never quite help himself telling people, "I did it. I lured them in. I baited the Russians into Afghanistan." And I guess it was a matter of public relations as to whether or not he was supposed to say that after 9/11. But he was insatiable.
And it's also a good illustration of kind of how policy in the late 1970s through the present kind of starts to form on a strategic level, really in the executive branch. Because Brzezinski sort of famously, like a lot of the CIA guys would like deny that there was any trap or something. And they would say, "That's poppycock. We never heard of it." And the way that, Brzezinski, he didn't need them to know about it. He kept things more siloed in particular, and was able to kind of influence policy from the top down in a way that I think, with the kind of like people, I think of Kissinger as sort of the ultimate, freelancer or whatever. But I think Brzezinski actually probably, deserves a fair bit of credit for, helping to secretly start what would become ultimately like the largest such covert operation in the history of the CIA and probably the history of the whole government.
And would this be Operation Cyclone?
Correct.
Absolutely, sir.
Okay, let's get into Operation Cyclone. This is essentially Charlie Wilson's war, right? I mean, this was our covert arming and backing of the Mujahideen fighting the Soviet army in Afghanistan. So, like, what describe like who was involved in Operation Cyclone and what did it actually entail?
At first, it was a much rougher, smaller, quick and dirty thing, and I think the idea that it started after the Soviet invasion is still present in a lot of vague historical memory. One of the things Brzezinski said in that interview we just cited was that no, I was doing that way before the invasion, at least a year before, but then. Even before that, the sources we tended to find were very insightful, really argue for almost a whole decade earlier, in the early 70s, because what happened then, we won't go too into it now, but there was not a communist, but a kind of progressive revolution in which the monarchy was abolished in Afghanistan. And just like the British 100 years earlier, oftentimes that was like a progressive who wanted to develop his country more was not lining up with our designs or our friends' designs in the region. And so we already were working back then with guys like the Mujahideen, who we'll come to talk about, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and Ahmad Shah Massoud, in the early 70s, not even the early 80s. So by the time you get to this turmoil going on with the communists fighting each other, and this guy Hafiz al-Amin, is he on the up and up? Either way, he's a psycho. He's killing everybody he can. The Soviets are very reluctant to go in, but because of the policy that is now definitely in motion in 78 and 79 of basically posing the problem, are we either going to let fundamentalist US-backed Islamic militants take over, or are we going to let this dictator keep making this country more and more into a crackpot, failed revolution just south of our border? Or, and at the end, this was a real consideration, is this dictator going to ally with the US and the fundamentalists? So they kept saying no to troop requests, but eventually, on the bazillionth vote, they finally said, this is probably a big mistake, but we just don't have any better ideas. And that really is what American diplomats said they were hearing. And they say, with regret, that if we had pursued a more conciliatory policy, they don't really believe the Soviets would have invaded, which again is very different from Vietnam. And the two camps in the American government were known as the bleeders and the dealers. Brzezinski was a bleeder. And the dealers were guys like, guys in the State Department, one of whom was unfortunately assassinated in Afghanistan in a very weird and intrigue-laden plot of its own that you can hear in the show. But once that guy was dead, once Brzezinski had started to kind of, block out everyone else and had Carter's ear, Cyclone began to grow. And by the early 80s, Charlie Wilson had really been kind of become a CI asset as a congressman, because he was working with Gus Stavrokotos, the Greek guy, who had since upgraded everything. And they both wanted more guns, more mujahideen, and more money for all of this. So by the mid-'80s, now the Soviets have for years been trying to get out. They've tried to go to the UN. They've been putting out feelers for Pakistan. And the U.S. is telling everyone, don't negotiate. The mujahideen don't negotiate. Pakistan don't negotiate. And so the stingers start arriving in 86 or something. Some people say that's the turning point. Either way, it's already been now half a decade that we've said, we're done when we say we're done. And so all of the BCCI transactions, all of the eventually legitimate, quote unquote, congressional approvals, this stuff is turning the war into something that I don't think anyone, including Brzezinski, might have ever thought would be as destructive for the Soviets, but also for regular Afghan civilians. And by the end of the 80s, I think the American calculation was we've done our job, Leonard Nimoy style. My work here is done, and they beamed out.
Another American demon who figures largely in this story, a man who's caused a great deal of bleeding over the course of his career, is CIA Director Bill Casey. What was so fascinating about this guy is that he was a Knight of Malta, an extremely conservative Catholic. And do you think that there was something in his religious background that caused him to have a certain affinity with austere Sunni Islam?
I think honestly it was being a lawyer. I think that was it. Really? He was I think it was being a corporate lawyer and then running the SEC, and then he was like, you know what we need to do? We need to get some Muslimic style operations in here. And I believe that was his takeaway.
Let's diversify our portfolio. But to your point, Steve Cole, who wrote a great book called Ghost Wars, although Ghost Wars interestingly says nothing about BCCI and some of these other things. So it's a slightly incomplete account, or maybe more than slightly. But he writes about Casey, saying that Casey saw the Roman Catholicism he believed in and Judeo-Christian, or whatever you want to say, values, very much compatible with political Islam as a way to defeat communism, because aren't we all basically on the same side?
Godless communism,
yeah, exactly. And now that's kind of a trope, or a bit of a joke to our generation, the idea. But he was very much about that, and it's more clubs. He was a Knight of Malta. Now you got the Safari Club. Anything where you had to call each other Prince or Your Highness to each other. He was really into. So it's no surprise he was really into this covert operation.
How would you describe his career and his involvement in Cyclone, the BCCI? I mean, his fingerprints are all over all of this.
Yeah, I mean, Casey was basically Casey was really fucking old by the time of all this. He had been in the OSS in the 1940s and World War II. He was, really kind of like this, kind of canonical operations cowboy figure. And so when he came to the CIA, the idea was a bit of we want to get the agency to have its mojo back after the 1970s. But, and we go into this a bit in the show, a lot of what he was just doing, I would argue, at least from the way he saw it from his vantage point, was he was just trying to kick as much shit up as possible with the Soviet Union, to just try and knife them as many ways with as many tools as he had at his disposal. And so you have some pretty, arcane and crazy plots, and also Latin America was a major place of interest for him. But so a lot of the plots like Iran Contra and the arming of the Mujahideen, which is a plot in its own right, they go back to they are able to be as successful or unsuccessful, but they take on the scale that they both of those things achieved because Bill Casey was cheerleading them, essentially.
If Brzezinski is the sort of cold and calculating architect of the policy, at least when it became a true, operation that was supposed to be sustained over years, then when he leaves, Carter gets obliterated by Reagan. Casey, still at the CIA, is the kind of giddy, inheritor of it, and he is, just sort of every day excited about new ways to train these guys in terror and to blow stuff up, bicycle bombs, and all these things. There were myths that the Soviets were using that are still reprinted, by the way, that the Soviets were like dropping toys that were actually bombs, so they could like literally kill children. Which sounds, so it's one of those things that sounds a little too evil that you always have to check up on. But what was real was a lot of the new forms of terrorism being taught to the Afghans at the request of Bill Casey and Gustav Rakotos and, of course, Charlie Wilson. But he was also a character that's hard not to find goofy. He was a mumbler, and no one could ever understand what the fuck he was saying. Reagan was apparently in
Maybe
some
that
meeting.
was strategic.
Maybe it was because he could have just sort of working toward the
He
mumbler.
was like talking like Boomhauer, and they were just signing off.
Dang old
Stinger missiles. Yeah.
dang old Islam, man.
Stinger Mujahideen Kabul, come on, man.
It's like this, man. The dust in the wind, man. Or like the dang old candle in the wind, man. It don't matter, man. It's all the oldies, old time. You know what I think, man? Like them dang old, I think, therefore you are, man.
That's a wonderful way of putting it. Apparently, Reagan was in a national security meeting at one point and like passed a note to, I don't know, some cabinet minister. And after Casey had finished, and it read, "Did you understand one goddamn word he said?" So I mean, he was a character as all these guys are, but yeah, he was funneling and apparently using Catholic institutions to funnel anti-communist funds throughout his entire reign as CIA director. Not just with regard to Afghanistan. Iran-Contra, it's important to close out on Casey. It's important to remember this whole season, Iran-Contra is happening as all this is happening. And the bad war, kind of like how Iraq was the bad war in the 2000s and Afghanistan was the right war. In the 80s, all the Democrats were basically against Iran-Contra. They thought it was gauche. They thought it was a little too evil, But the other side of the policy was arming the Contras in Afghanistan, essentially. And that was a very popular cause select.
The good war.
The good war.
And also there was, in season 1, we talked about how another, thing we did during that time was arm Saddam Hussein. And there were, indictments and prosecutions handed down for that later on. But like, much on a much, they're just historically considered much smaller. But all of which is just to say that like throughout this period, from Colombia to Central America to Afghanistan, I mean, you have just like, I believe Mexican Condor is an operation of this. Oh, Operation Greenback, which is the DEA beginning money laundering. But like, it's just, you've got like a really kind of, like the federal government was just doing a whole fucking lot in a whole lot of places. And Bill Casey in a lot of ways was like sort of the guy responsible for making sure that each of those endeavors could be as fully evolved a plot, Don DeLillo Libra style as it could be.
Yeah, his some of his underlings were like, what are we really working toward here? This is, not to say they weren't cold and calculating themselves, but they didn't find all this to be more than just kind of fun and games. But fun and games was Casey's. That was his deal. He loved it. He was giddy.
Well, I guess like I want to talk about like in a way to sort of understand emotionally or metaphorically the spread of covert fun and games and blowback across the entire face of the planet and indeed Lower Manhattan. I want to talk about the brilliant trailer that you guys produced with Ben Clarkson for this season of Blowback, which was like this really, I mean, if you haven't watched the trailer, it's an animated trailer for season 4 of Blowback done by Ben Clarkson. Could you describe a little bit about like the concept of that trailer and like the idea that you were trying to communicate and like in collaboration with Ben and like to communicate in an artistic, emotional way, like the themes of this season?
Yeah, it was very much a collaboration. I think Noah and I just had a call with him, and I said I wanted to treat this multi-limbed monster of drug money and bombs and instruments of terror, but also ideologies as this one monster to kind of give it this form, like the Thing is what I said, something that's constantly changing to its surroundings and growing and squeezing into the corners it needs to squeeze into and then becoming something else all over again. And Ben loved that whole sort of organic idea. And so when he started to show us sketches and what people can see, if you guys want to throw a link in as they can see the trailer, he really took that idea that I just had a vague sense of, and he started to lay out this little story in which some kind of toxic element is being developed in a lab.
I would describe it like the metaphor, the visual metaphor here for covert action as Akira goop.
Sure.
So the goop from Akira, when he like blows up into a giant flesh blob.
And I think also it was a little bit inspired by, say, the sentiment in my favorite deleted scene ever, which is that deleted scene in Nixon when he goes to see Richard Helms.
Right. Played by Sam Waterston, whose eyes turned black.
Yeah. He really leaned in on that one. But he's got his garden. And, as they're mugging it up, there is a great line where he says something about how covert operations are organic. They grow, they change shape. And without ripping that off too much, I thought maybe not the form of a flower, but this kind of, this thing that's alive. And he just did a fantastic job. Obviously, you guys have worked with him, but I couldn't be happier with. And I scored the trailer to complement Ben's visuals, and that was really fun, and it just turned out great.
I guess one of the best things about Blowback, or one of the best things about studying or learning about history, is discovering new guys.
Yeah,
learning about guys is like most of what history is, and I've talked about a few of them that grabbed my attention in the first couple episodes. But just for you, Brendan and Noah, do you have a favorite guy from this season, or someone that you discovered that you weren't aware of before, or someone whose story particularly strikes you, or character or personality that you remember from this season?
Noah, do you want to take it first? I think I know mine.
Yeah. I think I really like Charlie Flynn. That's Michael Flynn's brother. So he comes in like the later part of the season. We don't get to spend too much time with them, unfortunately, but like, if you read Michael Hastings' book, The Operators, or his story about Stan McChrystal, like Charlie Flynn just basically sounds like Michael Flynn 2.0. So like Charlie Flynn was Stan McChrystal's chief of staff, and he was just like kind of the guy in charge of making sure that like he was just like kind of chief vibes officer. And I honestly just felt like he was the guy in this whole thing who I just wanted to know more and more about.
Well, the Flynn brothers, the Flynn brothers even being there now that we know what it's like when you see that like Giuliani was going to be offered mayor of Baghdad at one point, and you're like, now you're just it hits different, as they say.
Yeah, exactly. That's it. Yes,
I would say mine is actually a guy named Kofor Black, and we've talked a lot about the 80s in this episode, which is good because I think people will listen to the show and know they'll see us sort of crawl toward the 90s and then into the 2000s, and that's all in the show. But from the later half of the season, Kofor Black was the counterterror chief for Bush, and he was this beefy bald guy who whether he was trying to look tougher than he was, or he was this big of a psycho, I don't know. But he wanted to literally put bin Laden's head on a stick. And he told his assistants who were on the ground, he's like, I want his head on a stick. And they're like, haha, yeah, but wait, are you serious? And he's like, I want you to get pikes and I want you to put it in ice so that we can put it in a box. And I want to show the president. And so people ordered pikes and ice so that they could literally take bin Laden's head and put it in a box, which of course they never got to do because for some reason he escaped from Tora Bora. But that guy was, but that guy. This is another great line. This is what I'll say. This is in Bob Woodward's book, and Bob Woodward has plenty of problems, but he does get some of the local color when you're in the White House. And there's a moment where he's talking to everybody, and he's assuring them, like the day after 9/11, don't worry, we're going to go out there, we're going to kill all of them. There's going to be we're going to have flies walking on their eyeballs. And that
By the end of the day.
And Woodward writes that for the rest of the time anyone was there, his nickname around the office became the flies walking on the eyeballs guy. And
that's real punchy. That rolls off the tongue.
I mean, I guess so. But he was definitely a real character. And he's always the pugnacious guy in the room, especially compared to Colin Powell and Paul Wolfowitz.
Yeah. Also, it was a big surprise getting Ashraf Ghani's voice. That was my other favorite thing.
The last president of Afghanistan, I have to say, when I finally put a clip in, he's like Warwick Davis a little bit. It caught me off guard.
It would be funny if that the order to put bin Laden's head on ice and then put it on a pike and deliver to the president. They never revised that when Obama got in, and someone presented a bungler with bin Laden's head.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
thank you.
I'm making love to his body, but in my mind,
his
head's on my desk.
Do I still have to tip if it took longer than 30 minutes?
Yeah. So there was a lot of psychos and bizarre people. I mean, the Mujahideen themselves, people can listen to the show. I mean, there's kind of a flavor for every tendency you have. There were guys who were really smooth criminals who got PR treatment from the West. There were really, really nasty guys who kind of originated the idea of acid in the face of women. That was one of our main guys. And there were mentors to Osama, several of them in the bunch. So, it's hard to really pick, but that's why people need to dive in, and just check it out.
Well, like I said, we have covered basically just merely the tip of the iceberg of the history that you guys lay out on this season. The geopolitics of the heroin trade, the American invasion of Afghanistan, and our subsequent withdrawal. But look, Brendan, I'm going to get you out here with an easy question, okay?
Mm-hmm.
All right. 9/11. What really happened there? What's the real truth?
I knew you were going to say that. That is the season. There's a long.
Is there any
answer.
more 9/11 truth that you guys have uncovered?
There's a little bit more truth that we found. We found a little.
There's some truth. There's some truth.
And just you have to sign up. But we found a lot of truth.
I guess we'll leave it there for today. Subscribe to Blowback to get the real 9/11 truth. That's the pitch we're going to leave you with. And before we close out today's show, I would like to leave you, listener, with a pitch that this upcoming Saturday, September 2nd, if you're in New York City, please come to the Roxy Cinema at 7:15. Hesse and I will be presenting a 35mm screening of Howard Hawks' Rio Bravo.
Oh,
that's
great.
right. To supplement our Movie Mindset bonus episode, we are hosting a screening, which we will do an intro and then a talk back after, of Howard Hawks' Rio Bravo this Saturday, September 2nd at the Roxy Hotel and Cinema.
And actually, we have a plug. Brendan and I will be in Chicago this coming weekend at the Haymarket Socialism Conference. We will be there. We have a panel on Monday, on Labor Day. And if you are in Chicago, if you're at Haymarket, you should come out and hang. We'd love to see you there.
Once again, thank you so much to Brendan and Noah. And we will play you out with some of the Blowback Season 4 original score composed by Brendan James. Gentlemen, thanks again for another season of Blowback, and thanks for coming on.
Thank you, boys.
Thank you.